The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Nebraska like ghostly fingers, dissipating slowly under the gentle warmth of an August sun in 1943. In the distance, the rhythmic sound of scythes cutting through golden wheat created a symphony that had echoed across American farmland for generations. But on this particular morning, the hands wielding those tools belonged not to American farmers, but to men who had once marched under Mussolini's banners across the deserts of North Africa. Giovanni Benedetti paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow as he gazed across the endless amber waves, a small piece of bread clutched in his weathered hand. Bread that was whiter and more abundant than any he had tasted in his entire life in war-torn Italy. This moment, repeated across thousands of American farms from California's sun-drenched valleys to Pennsylvania's fertile countryside, represented one of the most remarkable and least-known chapters of World War II, a story that would challenge everything these Italian soldiers believed about their American enemies and ultimately reveal the profound power of abundance over ideology. When Italy entered the war alongside Nazi Germany in June 1940, Benito Mussolini's propaganda machine painted a picture of American decadence and weakness. Italian soldiers were told they would face a nation grown soft by prosperity, a people lacking the martial spirit and discipline that defined the fascist ideal. The Americans, they were assured, were motivated only by profit and material comfort, possessing neither the will nor the strength to stand against the disciplined armies of the Axis powers. These beliefs sustained Italian forces as they fought across North Africa, even as British and Commonwealth forces began to push back against their advances. But by 1943, as the tide of war shifted decisively against the Axis, hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers found themselves facing capture. The fall of Sicily and the subsequent Italian campaign brought wave after wave of prisoners into Allied hands. Among them were nearly 51,000 Italian soldiers who would be transported across the Atlantic to a fate none of them could have imagined. Not to harsh prison camps or forced labor in dangerous industries, but to the green fields and family farms of rural America. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be treated humanely and, when possible, be allowed to work for wages that would supplement their basic needs. America, facing an acute labor shortage as millions of its young men served overseas, desperately needed workers to maintain agricultural production that was feeding not only the home front, but Allied forces around the world. The solution seemed practical. Italian prisoners would work American farms under guard, earning small wages while contributing to the war effort of the very nation they had recently fought against. What no one anticipated was how profoundly this arrangement would transform both the prisoners and their American hosts. The Italian soldiers arrived expecting the worst. Francesco Rossi, a former sergeant from a small village outside Naples, later wrote in his diary, "We prepared ourselves for slavery, for the harsh treatment we had heard the Americans gave to their enemies. We thought of the stories our officers told us, of a brutal people who cared nothing for honor or human dignity. Instead, they found themselves billeted in camps that, while certainly controlled and monitored, provided clean barracks, adequate clothing, and 3 meals a day that exceeded in quality and quantity anything most had experienced even before the war. But it was the bread that first began to crack the foundation of their preconceived notions. In fascist Italy, bread had been rationed since 1935, often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to stretch meager supplies. Dark, dense, and precious, every crumb was carefully conserved. Yet here in America, their captors served them white bread, soft, light, abundant white bread at every meal. Initially, many prisoners saved portions, hiding them in their belongings as they had learned to do during years of scarcity. Guards, noticing this behavior, gently explained that there would always be more tomorrow. The concept seemed impossible to grasp. Lorenzo Martinelli, a prisoner assigned to a dairy farm in Wisconsin, recalled decades later. The farmer's wife, Mrs. Johnson, she would pack our lunch each morning. Always there was bread, sometimes with butter, sometimes with jam made from berries that grew wild on the property. I kept thinking it was a trick, that tomorrow the food would stop coming. But tomorrow never came. The bread was always there. As weeks turned to months, the prisoners were assigned to farms across 45 states. They picked fruit in California orchards, harvested corn in Iowa, tended cattle in Texas, and worked tobacco fields in North Carolina. The work was hard. Agricultural labor always is, but it was honest work under open skies, not the industrial drudgery they had feared. More importantly, they were working alongside American farmers and their families, people who gradually transformed from captors into something approaching friends. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it universal. Some prisoners remained bitter, counting the days until they could return to Italy and resume their interrupted lives. Others maintained their fascist beliefs, convinced that American kindness was merely a sophisticated form of propaganda. But for thousands of Italian soldiers, daily exposure to American life began to erode the ideological certainties that had once seemed unshakable. They witnessed American farmers working their own land with their own hands, side by side with hired help and prisoners alike. They saw a democracy in action during the 1944 presidential election, watching as Americans freely debated the merits of Franklin, Roosevelt versus Thomas Dewey, without fear of arrest or persecution. They observed American families sharing their Sunday dinners with prisoners, inviting them to participate in harvest celebrations, and treating them not as conquered enemies, but as human beings caught in the machinery of war. Giuseppe Torino, assigned to a wheat farm in Kansas, wrote to his family in Italy, "These Americans, they are not what we were told. The farmer, Mr. Peterson, he works harder than any man I have known. His hands are as calloused as mine, his back as bent from labor. Yet he owns this land, decides what to plant, when to harvest. No commissar tells him his quota. No party official inspects his thoughts. He is free in a way I am beginning to understand we never were." The bread, that simple, abundant white bread, became a symbol of something larger. It represented not just material prosperity, but a different way of organizing society. In Italy, even before the war, bread was controlled by the state, rationed, regulated, politicized. Here in America, bread was simply bread, plentiful, available, taken for granted in a way that spoke to fundamental assumptions about human dignity and the role of government in daily life. Historical records from the War Department document the remarkable success of the prisoner of war program. Incidents of escape attempts declined dramatically as prisoners settled into farm life. Productivity reports consistently noted that Italian prisoners often worked harder and with greater skill than the temporary workers they had replaced. Farm families wrote letters to authorities praising the reliability and craftsmanship of their assigned prisoners. More telling were the reports of what happened when the war ended and repatriation began. As victory in Europe became inevitable and plans were made to return prisoners to Italy, an unexpected problem emerged. Thousands of Italian soldiers did not want to leave. They petitioned American authorities for permission to remain, to bring their families to America, to become American citizens. Maria Benedetti, Giovanni's wife, received a letter in early 1946 that captured the sentiment of thousands of Italian families. "My beloved Maria, I have seen a different world here. The bread is always white, always plenty. The farmers treat us as men, not as subjects. When you and the children can join me here, we will build a life such as we never dreamed possible in the old country. The American government, recognizing both the humanitarian dimension and the practical benefits of retaining skilled agricultural workers, eventually established programs that allowed many former prisoners to immigrate legally to the United States. By 1950, nearly 15,000 former Italian prisoners of war had become American citizens, joining the great tapestry of immigrant experiences that had always defined the American story. The impact extended beyond individual transformations. Letters from Italian prisoners to their families back home provided some of the first realistic descriptions of American life that many Italians had ever received. These accounts, spreading through villages and towns across Italy, helped prepare the ground for Italy's post-war embrace of democracy and its alignment with the Western Alliance. Former prisoners became informal ambassadors, sharing their experiences and challenging the lingering appeal of authoritarian ideologies. Dr. Flavio Conti, a captured Italian army physician who worked on a hospital farm in upstate New York, later became a prominent advocate for Italian-American friendship. In his 1965 memoir, he wrote, "We came to America as enemies and prisoners. We left as friends and, many of us, as future citizens. But more than that, we left as witnesses to a truth we had been taught to deny, that freedom and abundance are not weaknesses to be despised, but strengths to be cherished." The symbolic power of the bread extended into the broader narrative of the war itself. While German prisoners of war in America generally maintained their ideological rigidity and discipline, Italian prisoners demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation and transformation. This difference reflected deeper cultural distinctions, but also revealed something profound about the nature of totalitarian indoctrination. The Italian fascist system, for all its pageantry and rhetoric, had never fully captured the hearts and minds of ordinary Italians in the way that Nazism had penetrated German society. When confronted with an alternative model of civilization, many Italians proved ready to embrace it. The farms where these men worked became laboratories of democracy in miniature. Former enemies shared meals, celebrated harvests, mourned losses, and gradually built relationships that transcended the artificial boundaries of nationality and ideology. Children on these farms grew up playing with Italian prisoners who taught them simple words in another language while learning American customs and values. The prisoners, in turn, experienced American family life from the inside, observing the daily rhythms of a free society and participating in its most fundamental activities. American farm families, too, were changed by the experience. Many had never interacted closely with foreigners before, and their initial suspicions often gave way to genuine friendship and respect. Letters and diaries from the period reveal a growing appreciation among American farmers for the skill, dedication, and humanity of their former enemies. Mrs. Dorothy Hanson of Minnesota wrote to her sister in 1944, "When this war started, I thought all Italians were fascists who wanted to destroy America. Now I know that most of them are just men who want the same things we want: work, family, peace, and enough bread on the table." The statistical evidence supports these personal testimonies. Disciplinary problems among Italian prisoners were remarkably rare compared to German prisoners. Productivity on farms, employing Italian prisoners, consistently exceeded expectations. Most significantly, when given the opportunity to remain in America after the war, Italian former prisoners showed integration rates that surpassed most voluntary immigrant groups of the same period. As the 1940s drew to a close and the Cold War began to reshape global alignments, the story of Italian prisoners in America took on new significance. Italy's decisive rejection of communism in its 1948 elections was influenced, in part, by the positive reports sent home by former prisoners who had witnessed American prosperity and freedom firsthand. The Marshall Plan found fertile ground in Italy, where thousands of families had heard detailed descriptions of American abundance from sons, brothers, and husbands who had experienced it personally. The bread that had symbolized this transformation continued to carry meaning long after the war ended. Italian-American communities across the United States maintained traditions that blended Italian heritage with American abundance. Former prisoners who had stayed in America often became successful farmers, bakers, and small business owners, embodying the entrepreneurial spirit that had so impressed them during their captivity. Giovanni Benedetti, the soldier whose morning contemplation of wheat fields began this story, eventually brought his family to Nebraska in 1949. He purchased a small farm with savings accumulated during his years as a prisoner and hired worker, fulfilling a dream that would have been impossible in the rigid social hierarchies of pre-war Italy. His grandson, born an American citizen in 1955, would later serve in the United States Army during the Vietnam War, completing a circle of loyalty and belonging that began with a piece of white bread on a summer morning in 1943. The epilogue to this remarkable chapter of World War II reveals truths that extend far beyond the specific experience of Italian prisoners on American farms. It demonstrates the profound power of direct human contact to overcome ideological barriers and historical enemies. It shows how abundance, when shared generously, becomes a more powerful weapon than any artillery or propaganda. Most fundamentally, it illustrates that freedom and democracy are not merely political systems, but ways of life that can be experienced, understood, and embraced even by those who initially encounter them as prisoners. In the end, 50,000 Italian soldiers discovered in American captivity what millions of immigrants had found in American freedom: that this nation's greatest strength lay not in its military might or industrial capacity, but in its fundamental belief that human dignity transcends the accidents of birth, nationality, or political allegiance. They learned that the American dream was not propaganda, but daily reality, as tangible and nourishing as warm bread shared at a common table under the vast sky of the American heartland. And in learning this lesson, they became part of the story they had witnessed, carrying forward the promise that abundance and freedom, once experienced, become impossible to forget and irresistible to share.